Chapter 9, The Acceptance of the Atonement, Introduction. If we had to use one word to summarize the message of A Course in Miracles, it would be forgiveness. It is interesting that even though the concept has been mentioned and its themes implied throughout the text's first 8 chapters, it is not until chapter 9 that we find its first real discussion. We have already seen that we cannot understand how forgiveness works until we recognize the problem of the ego. As forgiveness has no meaning apart from its undoing of the ego's projections, we need first to understand the thought system of guilt, projection, and attack. Consequently, in keeping with the healing process of the Course, the Holy Spirit's plan of forgiveness is juxtaposed with the ego's. We need to discuss the ego's plan of forgiveness before we look at the Holy Spirit's correction for it. Before we embark on this discussion, however, we look at the particular factor of the ego thought system that gave rise to the need for correction. This returns us to the all-important theme of the ego's fear of the mind's choosing the Holy Spirit. We will find a particularly interesting extension of that theme in the contrast between the ego's grandiosity and the Holy Spirit's grandeur. I'm going to repeat that. We will find a particularly interesting extension of that theme in the contrast between the ego's grandiosity and the Holy Spirit's grandeur. The ego's fear of the atonement principle. We begin with the opening section of the chapter, which helps us look at the rationale for the thought system of projection that develops in response to the ego's fear of what we might do if we return to our minds. Reality cannot threaten anything except illusion, since reality can only uphold truth. The very fact that the will of God, which is what you are, is perceived as fearful, demonstrates that you are afraid of what you are. It is not then the will of God of which you are afraid, but yours. Our fear is not of God or His will, but of the power within our minds to choose His will, which means choosing against our self-image of a will separated from its source. This becomes even clearer in the next paragraph as Jesus extends His teaching about the ego's fear of atonement. Your will is not the ego's, and that is why the ego is against you. Remember that the ego tries to convince us that we, the decision-making self, are the ego, and that our will is to be separate from God. In our madness, we have chosen to identify with the ego's insane thought system, and it has taught that separation is our reality as an individual special self. Almost always in the Course, the word will is reserved for God or Spirit, but here it denotes the ego's wish to be separate. What seems to be the fear of God is really the fear of your own reality. This vitally important idea is simply stated here. It will be referred to many other times in our symphony, with the most important reference coming in the fear of redemption. Jesus is teaching us that the ego says we should be afraid of God, as seen in the wrong-minded box of the chart. Let's go ahead and look at that. So Jesus is teaching us that the ego says we should be afraid of God, as seen in the wrong-minded box of the chart. It tells us we have sinned against our Creator, who is justified in His wrathful retaliation, stealing back the life we believe we stole from Him. This gives rise to the fear of God, and we believe that to remain within our minds will result in instant death. In what is now a familiar idea to us, we seek to protect ourselves from this perceived horrible catastrophe. We have listened to the ego telling us we should leave our minds, become a body, forget we have a mind, and carry with us this ontological fear that takes the projected form of being indiscriminately afraid of everyone and everything in the world. Jesus, however, says to us that it is not the fear of God that is the issue, but the fear of our own reality, which really means the fear of our minds choosing this reality. In the ontological instant when we were confronted with the choice between the ego's interpretation of the tiny mad idea and the Holy Spirit's, we opted for the ego's. Separation is reality. We chose against the Holy Spirit's response that nothing had happened, the atonement, that we remain as God created us, having come from love and therefore are beings of love. This love is our reality, and choosing against it gave rise to the ego's fear that we would change our minds and choose again. It is not anything in the world that we truly fear or anything related to God. How can one fear illusion, let alone what is the only reality? It is only in the feverish dreams of our separated existence that reality becomes threatening, the light of its truth shining away the darkness of the ego's illusions.